we are going to talk about a topic today that has the news headlines spinning and a lot of people questioning what happens if a real estate deal falls apart. What are the penalties? And so we're going to go through three different situations. So what happens if you are a buyer and you cannot close on the deal? What happens if you are a seller and you can't close on the deal? And the third one is, what happens if you buy a property at a particular price and the bank doesn't appraise it for that price, and now there's a gap that you need to come up with?
So out of hundreds and hundreds of closings, I don't even know if we've had 10 or more deals have this happen. I hear stories from lawyers that have been doing this for like 2-3 decades, so 20, 30 plus years, because they lived through everything through the 70s and 80s, where interest rates were like 20%. Like, think about that, 20%.
All right, guys, welcome back to the Canadian Real Estate Channel. My name is Emma Pace, and I am very excited to be your host here. I run a real estate team named Monstera in Toronto, Ontario, and I am here with Ryan Carson from Carson Law, and we are going to talk about a topic today that has the news headlines spinning and a lot of people questioning what happens if a real estate deal falls apart. What are the penalties? And so we're going to go through three different situations. So what happens if you are a buyer and you cannot close on the deal? What happens if you are a seller and you can't close on the deal? And the third one is, what happens if you buy a property at a particular price and the bank doesn't appraise it for that price, and now there's a gap that you need to come up with? So we're going to talk about those three things today because, Ryan, we've both seen these situations occur a little more frequently than we have in the past. So let's talk about the buyer side. If the buyer can't close on the deal, what does this look like? What are the penalties for them?
Yeah, so if the buyer can't close on the deal, depending on the reasons for why the buyer can't close on the deal, there's going to be probable costs and damages that could be kicked back to them. So let's just go on the assumption that yes, to the seller. That's right. So let's just assume, take all assumptions and facts. The seller is completely, innocent of anything that would cause the deal not to close. It's just all the buyer's fault for one reason or another, and they have not completed the transaction, which is a firm and binding deal. That's important to realize too. Like, the deal obviously has to be firm, right? Yeah. So on all those assumptions of facts, etc., if the buyer's not able to close, then the seller still has to go through a process of what's called tender. So they show they're ready, willing, and able to close the deal. And by showing they're ready, willing, and able to close the deal, if the buyer cannot still close, failing there being any additional extensions or amendments or some other agreed upon solution to the breach, they've essentially been noted in breach and default of their obligations under the firm deal. And so the seller has to mitigate losses. They have to reasonably do their best efforts to make it so that, whatever they do now with this property, they are trying to make it so if they suffer any losses, costs, or damages, they're reduced and minimized as much as possible. So what does that mean? They have to relist it. And normally we always recommend, even though the market, it won't give that price, let's say that's the reason why the deal didn't close, relist for the price that they were supposed to buy it at, right? So that shows that you're at least trying to get the same amount of money back. If, nothing happens, within a week, then you listen to your realtor and you change prices accordingly thereafter, right? But at the end of the day, whatever that person sells that property for, right? Let's say it was supposed to be $1 million and it dropped to 800. You've got a loss of $200,000 that the buyer, because they breached, is responsible to. Yeah. So, and then you'd add to that 200 carrying costs, things like extra lawyer fees, storage costs, maybe extra interest costs on mortgages that are being carried, extra carrying costs of like utilities, insurance, property maintenance, etc., and so forth. So any and all those things get all added into this pot of, losses and damages. And then if, on the demand of the seller's lawyer, the buyer can't pay that, which they probably can't, there's a lawsuit started. And then it goes through the process of courts and everything like that. And ultimately, if found to be responsible by the courts, the buyer is going to have a judgment against them that is going to hold them accountable to pay this.
Right. So a question that I have for you, going back to the earlier point of buyer number one being unable to close on the transaction that they committed to. The seller goes back to market at the same price that that buyer number one originally committed to. Let's say, for the purposes of this video, that buyer number two comes along and purchases the property at the exact same price, right? So buyer number one was willing to pay $1 million. They go back to market at $1 million. Buyer two comes along, $1 million. What happens to the deposit? Because it's my understanding that you can't hold two deposits as a brokerage. So are you required to release buyer number one's deposit in order to accept the deposit of buyer number two?
So, yeah, so this is always because this is more like procedurally problematic for the real estate industry, like the realtors themselves, than it is lawyers. Because I'm not aware of anything legally, like just that law, like it could be a regulation of your profession, like brokerages and so forth, that has that rule. But I know that always comes up, right? So, I mean, I would say at the end of the day, in that circumstance where there really hasn't been a loss, or there's been actually a reselling of the property for a bit more money, unless there's been an excessive amount of time that's passed, and so there's a large amount of carrying costs or something, usually at that point, it's possible between the buyer and the sellers to probably, well, A, get some legal advice first, but B, you'll probably be given advice that you can sign a mutual release that'll put the deposit back over to the, the buyer, the buyer one who forfeited, and then allow you to get your, deposit for the new buyer and so forth, right? And then close on the new deal.
Yeah. So where my brain kind of goes on that is, because we've seen more conditions on offers, that if the buyer number two comes in with a firm deal, amazing. But if the seller releases the deposit back to buyer number one in order to take deal number two from the second buyer, and that's a conditional deal, and now all of a sudden buyer two can't come up with the money, have they just released the leverage that they originally had on buyer one?
Well, and exactly. And so that's where we as lawyers, honestly, unless there's some huge pressure from the brokerage that you have to, you can't have these two deposits.
Yeah.
We as lawyers never recommend doing that. Because of the fact that you need to have the second deal close first, actually close, as opposed to just have an agreement, right? So, I mean, number one, we'd say just don't do the release until, it's done.
Yeah.
If for some odd reason that is not allowed to just be the case and play out, I guess the other thing you could do is don't have the deposit be held by the brokerage, have it be held by the seller's lawyer.
Sure. Okay. So there's a good workaround. Let's talk about situation number two. And just to kind of recap what you said, for buyers, if you offer the seller a certain price, they are unable to sell the property for the same price that you originally offered, and there's a gap between the two, you are responsible not only for just the difference, you are also responsible for any other costs that are incurred, and it is the seller's responsibility to do everything they can to mitigate those costs. But in addition to whatever the discrepancy is from what you offered to what they are now able to get, especially as the market goes down, you may also be responsible for additional costs, depending on what those could be, such as closing costs, moving costs, storage costs, renos, etc. Right? Now, let's talk about the flip side. Let's say a seller is unable to close, but the buyer is ready to do so.
Yeah. So if this is pretty rare, because
Yes.
there's probably only a few situations that would predominantly come up for a seller not being able to. And it'd probably be like there's title issues, like there's some sort of defect in title. So it's not going to be conveyed properly or at all. So, I mean, that's a bit of a different situation altogether. Very specific. It turns on all the nuances of whatever the reasons are there. So that's a bit different. But it, same situation. If a seller can't close, buyer would show that they're ready, willing, and able to close through tender. And then if it's still not extended or somehow mutually resolved or released, then the buyer could take action through the courts, and seek not only any damages and costs, if that were applicable, but more likely what they'd be trying to do is get a judge to, provide what they call it, like an interlocutory order that they can't do anything with the property,
Okay.
or the lawyers register cautions and what are called certificates of pending litigation against the property. So it kind of makes it so they can't just go sell somewhere else.
Yeah.
Or something else happen to the property in the meantime while you're trying to go through the court process of suing them.
So you would have a lawyer basically put something. Does that get registered on title then? Like, it's something that would basically say like, hey, we're locking up your property from being able to do anything while this is being.
Yeah, there's different cautions. They're called cautions, that exist that you could potentially utilize in that scenario. There's also what is called a certificate of pending litigation that could potentially get registered as well.
Right. Okay.
So anyways, all these things potentially are used by the buyer's lawyer to kind of protect the buyer and their ability to still go after the seller in that particular property. But, similarly to the previous question of like, what's the seller's rights? I mean, the right is ultimately you can go to court. You can sue them for the breach of the contract. Not only might you seek damages and costs, but you may more particularly, because you're a buyer, try to be seeing can you get the court to order specific performance, which means they're ordered to fulfill the terms of the agreement.
Okay.
Right. So I mean, that's what you'd see in that kind of scenario.
Now, one thing that I want to clarify, because I think there's probably a lot of confusion, and again, something else that I don't think a lot of agents explain very clearly to their clients, is the title search date, right? And so you mentioned, this on the seller side of things doesn't happen that often. One of the reasons it could happen is if there were like some challenges with title. Maybe a contractor's registered a lien or there's something on title, right? So why don't we explain to anybody that's viewing this that might have some questions about how the title search works? Like, what is the date? How many days do you have before closing to typically look into title, right? And what does that even mean? Because that's such a industry term where it's like, cool, we get it. And if I had never bought a house or sold a house, or if this wasn't my job, I'd be like, I don't know what that means.
Yeah, no, 100%. So there'll be two key dates in any agreement of purchase and sale. The one is the closing date, or they call it the completion date. And then the other one, which will be earlier than that date, is called the requisition or title search due date. And so, and that's typically found in section 8. And then the corresponding other sections are 9 and 10 in the agreement. But this particular part of the agreement, the title search due date, allows the buyer's lawyer to review the actual ownership in the land registry office of the property that's being acquired, and then write a letter of what's called requisition to the seller's lawyer to say, hey, we've checked title. Here's our demands of you. That's what the requisition is. Here's our demands of you. You need to satisfy us that all of this is taken care of on or before the closing, right? Or on or before another date, if another date's required to be used, right? But basically, that title search date, typically, if like you had a closing on the 30th of the month, you probably wouldn't want it any later than the 15th. If the deal was agreed to on the 1st, because you want to provide a couple weeks time for your buyer's lawyer to actually review the agreement and search title. So that's from the 1st to the 15th. and then you need from the 15th to the 30th or greater for the seller's lawyer to like respond and fix anything if there's something to fix, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't make a, it's not, obviously everybody has a, like, depending on who you're acting for, like the longer you can make the title search closer to the closing date, if you're for the buyer, that's advantageous because it's like, oh, now I can make requisitions almost right up to the closing date.
Yeah.
So it's kind of making a bit like conditional. If there's a title issue, if that's the reason the deal didn't close.
Yeah.
But you can see, practically speaking, well, that makes it almost impossible to fix anything for the seller, right? So, yeah. And then obviously the sellers want it as early as possible because then Section 10, as I alluded to, as connected with Section 8 in the agreement, says if requisitions have been submitted on time or before the title search due date,
yeah,
and those requisitions of title cannot be satisfied to the mutual parties agreement, then you can terminate the deal, more or less is what it says.
Yeah. So for anybody that's watching, it's fairly common for 2 weeks prior to closing. Like most agents will set it exactly 2 weeks prior to closing for your lawyers to be able to look into this. And again, it's if you have a 90-day, if you've got a 90-day closing, you don't want to check title on day one because you still got a whole 90 days to happen. What if something gets registered between now and then, kind of thing, right? So 2 weeks prior to closing is typically when your lawyer will go in, verify that you're receiving this property without any challenges, right? It's free and clear, no weird stuff happening with it. Sellers come off and you go on as the owner of the property, right? So the third thing that I wanted to talk to you about was appraisal issues, because I've seen this happen a couple of times recently. And so for anybody that doesn't know what an appraisal is, when you purchase a house, not only do you have to qualify when you get your pre-approval, but the house also has to qualify with the bank. So just because you fall in love with the house and you think it's worth $1 million, the bank is holding the bulk, they're lending you the bulk of the money in most circumstances. And so they need to go in there and say, hey, this house we think is worth $1 million, or you put $1 million on a piece of paper and we think it's actually worth 900. And so if that's the appraisal process, is them going in to verify what the bank feels that the property is worth. And so in a market like today, you have to be very cautious to make sure that the bank is going to feel that the property is worth what you've paid for it. And in the event that there's any discrepancies, so you offered to pay the seller $1 million and the bank thinks it's worth 900, there's now a $100,000 gap that needs to be bridged. This is something that's coming up more commonly now than we've seen before. So let's talk about how frequently you've seen that and some solutions. If that was to happen to somebody, what are some solutions that they can utilize to bridge that gap if they get stuck in a pinch?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great point to talk about, because it is probably something that we're seeing now that the market is kind of in a fluctuating state, as it's shifted from being at an all-time kind of seller's market to now more of a buyer's market, and also because Bank of Canada has been very active in increasing the interest rate, the federal interest rate. Obviously, that until they kind of stay settle or start to drop the rate again, I think that's obviously got a lot of people just pausing, right? But every time they change it, if it makes things, if they go up with interest rates and they make things more expensive and then so forth, the issue is obviously people's ability, like their buying power is decreased, because now the interest rate is higher, so what they can afford becomes like they got to get a corresponding lower price. But then also, because there's fewer people rushing to the market now, and so you have fewer transactions buying and selling, the issue is obviously appraisers who work for the bank are being conservative with their valuations, because ultimately, once the banks lend the money on the appraisal price, if there's a problem and they have to enforce and go power of sale and sell that property, they're going to be expecting that at the very least they're going to get the amount of their money back that they've lent.
Recoup the costs that they've lent out for sure.
That's right. And so at the end of the day, sometimes like we saw, earlier in 2022 at the height of the seller's market, people were bidding over the listing price by hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know a house in my neighborhood actually sold for $900,000 over list. So, that's an exceptional circumstance, but very not uncommon to see, people bidding 100 or 200 over whatever the list price was. And so at that time, because people were just kind of printing money on this stuff, appraisers felt very comfortable. Oh, no problem. Like tomorrow, this house would sell for another 100K, right?
Yeah.
So appraisers were very happy to match purchase prices in that market. Now that the market has changed, I don't think the value of real estate has really changed. I think, that's a different kind of question. I don't think the value's really changed. I think it's just everybody's just got to be a bit more cautious and safe right now. And so appraisers are kind of like, okay, yes, we agree to that price, that agreement price, no problem. That's the appraised value after we do our appraisal. But some of them are saying, no, you agreed to $1 million. We think it's only 800. So the problem, as you pointed out, is now that buyer, even though they've agreed to buy for $1 million, they have to make sure that they have extra 200,000 available because the bank is only going to lend on 800, not $1 million.
Yeah.
And so when that's come up, fortunately, and you might find this surprising, I have not seen it happen that often. Like, we're doing hundreds of closings in a month, and we've been, we do this consistently through the whole year. So since the market has started to shift in, I would say April, May, and you've really seen this change in interest rates through the last couple months, which has significantly changed, market pricing and appraisals and all that kind of stuff, probably had less than 10.
Okay.
So out of hundreds and hundreds of closings, I don't even know if we've had 10 or more deals have this happen, right? Now, this is a little bit more, I would say, in the primary buying and selling market. It's like, so you are buying and selling your personal residence, right? With investors, because the investor deals are a bit different and so forth, that it might be a bit of a different situation there. That statistic might be a bit different. And to be honest, you might be surprised it's not as bad, because most investors are using B or private money anyways, or they're using a different financing strategy, right? So, if there's investors out there, and so this might be a plug to a secondary little topic, but I think it's a great time to buy. I think you just have to understand what your buying platform is now, because if you could buy 2 million 6 months ago, you're not probably buying 2 million now, because the carrying cost has shifted.
Yeah.
But the good news is, with carrying costs shifting up, the purchase price has shifted down. So you just have to find that match where now they're together, right? Yeah. And you might actually find that, just like the old saying goes, buy low, sell high. Why not buy now? Because if somebody is out there and they are not taking their property off the market, it means they're obviously motivated to sell. Yeah. So, and you have fewer buyers. And so now it's like, hey, I can, not that you want to take advantage, but I can be a bit harder. Whereas, let's be honest, 6 months ago, sellers were not giving people handouts, right? Yeah. So, little plug, is it still good to be in real estate? I think if you're a buyer, it's a great time to be in real estate. Just understand your new buying platform and your carrying costs. That's all, right? Like, you just, and you have to get away from being fixated on rates as being what values a deal, and focus on all the other pieces of the investment. So that's just a bit of a plug for that topic there. But getting back to what you were asking about, the appraisals and how do you deal with those issues.
Yeah.
I mean, one great way to deal with it is to be proactive and have a backup plan. So going into buying and offering on real estate, yes, hope that you have bank A, giving you the best rate going and all this stuff, but have a backup plan. Like maybe work with a broker or a, bank rep who can tell you, okay, we're going to try to go with RBC. RBC's current rate is this. Here's your range you can buy. But I'm going to make sure that you could still qualify for like a private second if we needed it, or a private first altogether. And here's what that would look like.
Yeah.
So, that might have somebody say to themselves, oh, this range, maybe this is a bit too high for me. Maybe I'll come down a little bit lower. So if I need the private second or like a B lender instead of the A lender, I'm at a price point that I still am going to like what I buy.
Yeah.
But I'm also safe if I get screwed on the appraisal and I can't finance as much.
Yeah, and I've seen on my side too, or not for any of my personal deals, but with other people that I know in the industry, if there was a gap, and let's say it's not that large, maybe it's not 200 grand, maybe it's 25 grand, and you don't have cash, trying to open up the lines of communication with the seller to see if they would be willing to do a vendor take back for the additional amount for a certain period of time. Now, this is a much more, it's typically a more advanced strategy for investors to use, but these are all the tools in your tool belt. I think we get like analysis paralysis as buyers where we're like, we have to be solution oriented, right? Just because a problem pops up doesn't mean that you can't get around that problem. So the goal of this video is to understand what the repercussions of you not finding a solution, but then also saying before you go to the end of the earth and panic, you can fill in this gap with X, Y, and Z, basically.
That's a great description of it all, Emma. If you're working with a good realtor, a good mortgage, representative, and a good lawyer, some combination of all of those three, and you can be open-minded, you might not be happy initially, but at the end of the day, I think there are always some solutions that are out there. I mean, you got to try to go through those possible solutions before you just panic and say, nope, I'm done. If they want to sue me, go for it. Because you say that, like somebody would say that, but trust me, you don't want to get sued for like anything, let alone hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's kind of what we're seeing, at least in our geographic area. Like you're talking drops of a couple $100,000, and if you don't own anything, like if you have a very low asset base, well, you might be a little bit like what they would call creditor proof. Like all they're going to do is maybe garnish like your wage or something, but that's going to have an impact on your life as well, right? But if you have assets, then you should be focused on like trying to figure out what can I do here, because like if you were going to sell to buy and you just don't buy now because you couldn't sell, you still own this house. Well, like they put in a lawsuit to sue you, like they're going to get something out of that property. Like they could force you to sell, and that's, again, there's, I think too many people think like, oh yeah, sure, what are you going to do, sue me, whatever, and it's like, yeah, they will. So have an open mindset, don't panic. I mean, it's definitely easy to panic, but don't panic. Lean on some of your advisors who are out there, like your realtor and your mortgage rep and your lawyer. Like we are working with all those different options and tools with people, talking to people about private lending, B lending, doing a short term like second to help make up the difference. If you're an investor, you might have other properties that you could leverage to pull equity out of to do an acquisition that you're now in a tougher spot on. There could be a lot of options for people, right?
You just have the lesser of two evils, right? It's like, do you want to get sued for this, Or do you want to pay a little bit more money, which still sucks? I'm not saying it doesn't suck. It's still more expensive, but it is less expensive than the be-all, end-all solution of going through a lawsuit.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and so at the end of the day, I think it's being open-minded and just trying to get away from what I said earlier, which is that and I think that's something that this is the market right now is really demonstrating. It's how closely we equate the value and the price of real estate to interest rates, which is really crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's like the fluctuation of gas every day.
Yeah.
Like that's not where the value of real estate should be deriving its source of value from. Like, I mean, anybody who's like younger and newer in the real estate market, I mean, and I look probably older than I am, which is thanks to stressful deals. But I mean, the bottom line is like, I hear stories from lawyers that have been doing this for like 2-3 decades, so 20, 30 plus years, because they lived through everything through the 70s and 80s, where interest rates were like 20%. Like, think about that, 20%, right? Obviously, purchase prices were not the same, but what people made was less too, right? So everything had a way of being balanced, right? You know, and even when I first started buying real estate, almost 20 years ago, and being in this racket, you know, for the last 17 years, like my interest rate was like 6-7%, you know, and that was from like A+ Royal Bank, right? Like, you know, people aren't getting better deals, like that's the rate. And so when I saw and experienced and got to benefit an interest rate of 1.5 or like 1.7, like that got like, if you thought that was going to be where it existed forever, you were not living in a real world. Like 3%, 4%, even 5% is still, when you look at the history of interest rates for mortgages, quite low.
Yeah.
So you have to open your mindset.
And just before we wrap up here, I wanted to, because we're talking about some intricacies, like things have changed, and as a result, we're seeing some, you know, more hiccups in deals than we've probably seen before. And what that equates to is typically more work for everybody, right? It's more problems and solutions and thinking and conversations and all of this kind of stuff. And so the final tally for your legal bill might, if you have to go through these things, it might not be the same as what it would be for just a smooth, simple transaction. And so what I'd love for you to just shed some light on is, you know, what does it typically cost somebody for hey, everything's all good, no big deal, come here and sign, quick and easy transaction, versus, you know, something that maybe gets more intricate, and where do the costs kind of add up? Because I think that's also something that I could understand, as if I was a lawyer, would be very frustrating when there's an expectation, a bunch of extra work that needs to happen, and then you're like, you get some pushback on maybe a final bill or something like that.
I love you, Emma. Thanks. Thanks for this opportunity.
Yes.
You know, you're bang on, right? Like, it is frustrating because obviously they've, you know, we're right at the very end of the process. So depending on how great it's gone to that point, we either get everybody's happiness or anger, right? Yeah. And it might have nothing to do with us, right? Like maybe they had a great experience with the realtor and the mortgage broker not so much, or vice versa, or both of them were terrible. And now they're at me and they're just angry, right? Yeah. They're like so mad about this deal. It's been stressful and emotional. And even though we're like, hey, how are you? I'm Carson Law. You know, we're gonna have a hard. It's gonna be a work in progress for us. But let's say everything was great, and they come to us and they're happy with us, and the file's starting really well. And then lo and behold, no one can do anything about it, and the deal is looking like it's going sideways, right? What we personally do is when we open our file, we send out an email. It's got what's called a retainer agreement, which obviously we hope all our clients read. And it basically says, here's the list of what you are getting in the, like, we do everything by a block price. So like when you go into your mechanic and say, hey, give me an oil, lube, and filter, they're like, yeah, it's $100 plus HST. and this is what you get for that $100. So we do the same thing. Here's your price for the fees. Here's what you'll get. But then the retainer agreement goes on to say, hey, just so you know, if stuff happens on the file and it means we have to do additional time or work outside of this list, it's charged at the lawyer's hourly rate, right? We, of course, we try to be very cognizant of the fact that if we're having to do that, it probably means the client, if they're not upset with us, they're going to be upset because this didn't go like the way they thought, and something's happened with something that's probably a bigger deal, like financing changed or something, right? So even if at the end of the day we spent 10 extra hours, am I going to charge you, $4,000? Probably not. I'm probably going to present to you to say, hey, just so you know, here's all the extra time we spent on this thing. Hopefully you see that was valuable because we solved your problem, and you at the end of the day got this house, and now you've got an exciting chapter to move forward on. But our bill's gonna, we're gonna have to increase it from the 2,000 that you thought it was gonna be. Am I going to charge you the 4,000 because I spent 10 hours, at hourly rate? No, I'm going to agree that let's say that it's 1,000 or 2,000 or something.
Yeah, let's figure out a solution.
But let's try to be fair about it.
Yeah.
Fair for me would be I charge my time,
yeah.
but I'm trying to make sure also that we're talking to people, and I'm not in this business to just do little one-offs and never see them again. I want them to come back to us, whether they're an investor and we do like, a dozen deals a year with them, whether it's like just your personal client, Emma, and they just bought their first house ever. I want to be able to say to them, hey, we're your lawyer for life. Whenever you have real estate matters, you're coming to see us. But now that you've bought real estate, here's other stuff we do, right? Let's talk about your wills now. Let's talk about, I realize one of you owns your own business. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. These sorts of things, right? Like, it's really about, for us, the relationship. So is there going to be an extra cost? Yes, we try to be as fair about it as we can while still feeling like we haven't devalued ourselves and what we've provided. We don't always get to tell you, like, in the minutes that it's happening, like, hey, here's what your bill is, because if you can imagine, like, if it's all happening on the closing date, like, I don't have a lot. I got only enough time to find the solutions, talk to people, give you your options, and then you say go, right? Like, I don't also get to say, hey, by the way, I just spent 5 extra hours. That's going to be $2,000, right? Like, it's hard to do that when you're literally in the moments, and the minutes all count, right? And that's probably similar for most real estate lawyers. Some that have a bit more time or have less volume may be able to sit there and talk to the person a little bit more as, like, the bill increases, like, hey, just so you know, this is where you are. And that's certainly a goal for us to work towards and try to do. I just know when you combine volume and, like, the craziness of, like, trying to get the thing resolved, sometimes it's hard to give people real time, this is what your account's up to. But that's why we also try to be pretty fair about it, to say, hey, this is what we could charge because it's the time we spent. But, how do you feel about it being an extra 1,000? Like, we think that's fair, given everything that's occurred, and because we want to keep working with you, right? Okay. So we kind of do that sort of thing is how, like, I approach it, and most of the lawyers in my firm approach that kind of thing. That might not be everybody's approach. I would say, and this is without registration costs and title insurance, the average purchase is like a $2,000, $2,500 kind of all in with, like, legal fees and disbursements. Like, that's kind of a range you're looking at. That might be, some people might be hearing this and say, oh, that's higher than I'm used to hearing. And some people might say, oh, that's lower than I'm used to hearing. That's kind of where we are. Like, we don't try to be the highest or the lowest, just try to be, like, in the middle there. I'd say sales is like 1,200 to 1,500, like, kind of in that ballpark. Again, that doesn't take into account, some possible, like, registration and taxes. But like the biggest thing that, increases your closing costs on a purchase will be the purchase price and the mortgage value themselves, because that is what title insurance is
based off.
Based off. So the higher that number, the higher your cost of that title insurance premium.
Totally. Okay, that was a ton of information. I think people are going to find a lot of value in this. I think we went like pretty well down the funnel here. So if somebody wants to get in contact with you, Ryan, and you end up being their go-to guy, how do they get in contact with you?
Yeah, well, we'd be happy to be everybody's go-to person. So reach out to us at carsonlaw.ca, follow us on social media, like us, etc. Email me anytime, ryan@carsonlaw.ca, and I'm happy to get back to you promptly, with answers to your questions and inquiries. So thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sticking around. If you found any value in this video, make sure you give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you in the next one.